Some storms don't just break fences, they drop secrets out of the sky. The first thing Ethan Carter noticed was the smell. Not rain, not wet soil, not even the sharp mineral tang that rolled over his fields whenever the North Ridge lightning towers took a hit. This was different. It smelled like hot metal and ozone, like a wrench left too close to a welder, like the air itself had been split open and sealed back wrong. He stood on the porch of his farmhouse with one hand braced against the doorframe and watched the storm turn his land into a shifting black and silver sea. Sheets of rain slashed sideways across the soybean rows. The old windmill at the far edge of the property groaned in protest. Somewhere beyond the equipment shed, one of the fence alarms chirped twice, then went dead. Perfect, Ethan muttered, already reaching for his canvas jacket. Out here on the edge of the colony belt, storms didn't ask permission. They came screaming over the plains, rattled your windows, flooded your lower field, and dared you to pretend you were still in control of something. He pulled his hat low and stepped into the rain. Cold water hit him hard enough to sting. Mud grabbed at his boots as he crossed the yard, flashlight beams shaking over drowned grass, rusted tractor parts, and the silver ribs of irrigation pipes half buried in the dark. Another burst of lightning flashed across the clouds, not white but blue, too blue, bright enough to turn every raindrop into glass. That was when he saw it. Something fell out of the sky. It wasn't a shuttle. It wasn't a drone. It was too small, too fast, and for one impossible second it looked almost human, wrapped in a halo of pale light before it vanished behind the fence line near the east field with a muffled thud Ethan felt through the soles of his boots. He stopped walking. The rain hammered his shoulders. Every warning bulletin he had heard over the last 6 months came back at once, smugglers using the outer farms for cover, fugitives slipping through weather fronts, things that crashed and were better left alone until the authorities arrived. He should have turned around right then. He should have gone back inside, sealed the doors, and called it in from the kitchen where it was dry and warm and sane. Instead, Ethan cursed under his breath and started toward the east field. By the time he reached the broken stretch of fence, the beam of his flashlight had begun to tremble in his grip. Not from fear, he told himself. Just the cold. The tall grass bent flat in a rough circle where something had come down hard. Steam rose from the ground in thin twisting lines. And in the middle of it, half curled against the mud and rain, was a woman. She wore no suit Ethan recognized, only a dark travel garment torn at one shoulder and soaked through with rain, the fabric clinging heavily as if it had absorbed more than water. Her hair, silver in the flashlight glow, was plastered across her face. One hand was pressed weakly into the dirt, like she had tried to stand and changed her mind. Ethan's breath caught. She was alive. Barely conscious, maybe, but alive. Her eyes opened at the sound of his boots. They weren't human eyes. Too bright. Too steady, even now. She looked at him with the kind of exhausted suspicion that belonged to someone who had run out of good options hours ago. "Don't," she whispered, her voice rough and low, almost swallowed by the rain. Ethan stared at her, rain dripping off the brim of his hat, the wind tugging at his jacket, his common sense already losing ground to the oldest rule he had left. Nobody got left outside in a storm. "Yeah," he said quietly, kneeling in the mud, "I figured you might say that." For a second, she did not move, and Ethan thought she might have slipped back under. Then her fingers tightened in the mud, elegant even shaking, and he saw how hard she was fighting just to stay conscious. Up close, the strange details came sharper through the rain. Her skin was not pale the way he had first thought. It held a faint cool undertone, like moonlight on blue glass, subtle enough to miss unless lightning caught it. A thin line of silver traced the side of her neck beneath the torn collar of her garment, not jewelry, not fabric, something finer. Her breathing was shallow. Controlled. Deliberate. Like she had learned long ago that pain was private business. "You hit your head?" Ethan asked. She blinked at him as if the question itself were offensive. "I am. Not helpless." Her voice had more strength now, and it carried an accent he could not place. Precise. Musical. Too polished for anywhere within 500 miles of the colony farms. That was not the question, Ethan said. She tried to push herself up and got about 3 inches before her arm gave out. He caught her under the shoulders before she could slide back into the grass. The second he touched her, she went rigid. Not frightened. Alert. Evaluating. Like even half-conscious, she was still deciding whether he was worth trusting. Easy, he said. You are freezing. I am not. She was. Rainwater had soaked straight through her clothes, and the storm wind had teeth now, cutting through the open field with a steady hard whistle. Ethan glanced at the farmhouse light burning warm in the distance, then back at the stranger in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, but not fragile. There was wiry strength in her, the kind built by endurance, not comfort. You can argue with me inside, he said. Or you can stay out here and prove a point to the weather. Your choice. Her eyes narrowed at that, bright and unsettling in the dark. For one strange beat he thought she might actually refuse out of pride alone. Then another gust tore across the field, and whatever reserve she had left seemed to drain with it. One night, she said quietly. I leave at first light. Ethan almost smiled. Sure. He slid one arm behind her back and the other beneath her knees, then lifted her clear of the mud. She made a small sound of protest, more dignity than fear, and he felt her tense again. You do this with all strangers? She asked. Only the ones that fall out of electrical storms. The answer earned him a look that might have been disbelief, might have been irritation. Hard to tell in the rain. He carried her through the broken fence and across the yard while the storm rattled the sheds and sent sheets of water skimming off the roofline. Halfway to the porch, the yard floodlight flickered, buzzed, and died, leaving only the porch lamp and the blue pulse of distant lightning. Perfect timing, Ethan muttered. Inside, the house hit them with a wash of dry heat, old wood, and coffee grounds. The stranger flinched at the sudden warmth like. It had caught her off guard. Ethan set her gently in the old kitchen chair near the stove, then crossed to lock the front door out of habit more than fear. When he turned back, she was sitting straighter now despite the tremor in her hands, rain dripping from silver hair onto his clean floor, every inch of her trying to reclaim control. Name? He asked. She hesitated. It was small, barely there, but he saw it. The pause of someone reaching for something that was not true. Lena, she said. Ethan leaned against the counter and studied her for a moment, listening to the storm beat against the windows and the old refrigerator hum in the corner. All right, Lena, he said. Let us get one thing straight. I am going to make coffee, find you a blanket, and take a look at that shoulder. You can hate every second of it if you want. But tonight, you are staying alive in my kitchen. The kitchen light was too honest for secrets. Ethan saw that the moment Lena lifted her face fully into it. Rain had washed the mud away, but it had not softened anything else. Her features were fine and striking in a way that did not belong out here among feed catalogs, tractor manuals, and boots drying by the stove. There was nothing fragile about her, though. Even sitting in one of his old wooden chairs with water dripping from her sleeves onto the floorboards, she held herself with the kind of control he had only seen in officers and people who had never once needed to ask permission to enter a room. Ethan set a mug near her hands and watched the steam curl up between them. It is coffee, he said. Not poison. Her gaze moved from the mug to him, suspicious enough to be almost impressive. That is a very specific reassurance. You are in farm country, Ethan said, reaching for the first aid tin above the sink. If I wanted to poison somebody, I would not waste good coffee on it. For the first time, something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile exactly. More like her pride had briefly considered making room for one and changed its mind. She wrapped both hands around the mug but did not drink. Ethan crouched beside the stove and fed another split. Log into the firebox. The house answered with soft old sounds he knew by heart, the pop of heating metal, the click in the pipes, the faint rattle in the window over the sink when the wind leaned hard from the east. Outside, the storm still scraped at the fields, but in here the warmth gathered low and steady. He stood again and set the first aid tin on the table. "Shoulder," he said. "No," Lena replied. "That was quick. I said I would stay alive in your kitchen. I did not agree to be examined." Ethan pulled open a drawer and took out a clean dish towel. "You fell out of the sky onto my soybean field. I landed. Badly." Her eyes flashed. "I have experienced worse." Ethan believed her, and that bothered him more than he expected. He wet the towel at the sink, wrung it out, and brought it back to the table. Then this should not be a problem. She watched him approach with the kind of attention that made him think she was measuring distance, angles, exits. Not nervous. Trained. He stopped a step away and held out the towel instead of touching her. After a long moment, she took it herself and pressed it to the torn shoulder of her garment. The fabric shifted just enough for Ethan to glimpse the mark beneath. A thin pattern of silver curved along her skin in clean geometric lines, almost like circuitry, almost like ceremonial ink. It caught the kitchen light and vanished when she pulled the cloth back into place. "Medical patch?" he asked. "Something like that." It was a lie, and not a very good one. Ethan said nothing. He moved to the counter and opened the cabinet where he kept spare blankets for winter outages. When he turned back, Lena was studying the room with a careful stillness that said more than questions would have. Her eyes passed over the worn pine table, the boots by the door, the shelf of seed samples labeled in black marker, the hand-drawn weather charts pinned near the radio. Nothing in this house was expensive. Nothing was decorative for the sake of being seen. It was a working place built by necessity and repaired by habit. Yet she looked at it like it was foreign in a way palaces probably looked foreign to men like Ethan. "You live here alone?" she asked. "Just me. By choice?" Ethan draped the blanket over the back of her chair. "You ask a lot of questions for someone using a fake name." Her fingers tightened almost invisibly around the mug. There it was again, that tiny pause before she answered. "You assume too much." "Maybe." He leaned one hip against the counter and folded his arms. Rain hissed against the glass. The porch light threw a dull gold square across the kitchen floor. "But I know what it looks like when somebody is trying very hard not to belong anywhere." For the first time since he carried her inside, Lena looked at him without irritation, without distance, without that polished wall she kept lifting between herself and the room. It lasted only a second. Then she lowered her eyes to the coffee, and when she finally took a sip, it was with the expression of someone discovering warmth had a cost. The storm settled into a steady assault on the house, less theatrical now, more relentless. Rain tapped hard against the windows, then dragged its nails down the glass in long uneven lines. Somewhere above the kitchen, the old gutters rattled under the runoff. Ethan checked the clock on the microwave. 11:23. Too late for company, too early for sleep. He reached past the stove and set a folded flannel shirt and a pair of gray sweatpants on the far end of the table. "Dry clothes," he said. "They are clean, even if they are not impressive." Lena looked at the stack as if it had personally insulted her. "I will manage." "In what, exactly?" Ethan asked. "Those clothes are soaked through." "That is temporary. So is getting pneumonia, if you are lucky." Her gaze lifted to his, sharp enough to cut. "You assume my biology is similar enough for that comparison to matter." Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose. "Fair point. Then let me put it this way. Whatever species you are, sitting in wet clothes next to my stove all night seems like a terrible plan." That earned him silence, which in her case was not surrender so much as strategic withdrawal. He turned toward the sink and rinsed out the mug she had not finished. The kitchen settled around them again, warmed by the low orange glow of the stove and the dim yellow light. Over the table. Behind him he could feel her still watching everything. Not the way most strangers did, glancing around out of curiosity or caution. Lena seemed to catalogue the room with methodical precision, as if every object might matter later. The battery lantern on the shelf. The weather radio by the fruit bowl. The boot scraper by the back door. Even the old framed photograph on the windowsill, turned halfway toward the room. Ethan noticed her eyes pause there. "My parents," he said. "Took that the year they got the place running. You keep few personal things visible." He shrugged. "Nothing much to display." "That is not the same as having nothing." Ethan dried the mug with a towel and hung it on the cabinet handle. "You always talk like that." "Like what?" "Like every sentence has already been reviewed by 3 lawyers and a committee." Her expression changed just enough for him to know the remark landed. "And you always speak without weighing the consequences first." "Most farmers do. If we waited for perfect conditions, nothing would ever get planted." For a moment, the answer seemed to catch her off guard. She lowered her eyes, not in submission, but in thought, as if the idea belonged to some world she had not studied closely enough. Then the lights flickered. Once. Twice. The refrigerator hummed louder, then cut out. The overhead bulb went dark, and the kitchen dropped into amber shadows lit only by the stove and the lightning muttering beyond the curtains. Ethan swore softly and reached for the lantern. "Transformer on the county line again," he said. "Power usually comes back if the tower relays hold." He clicked the lantern on, and cool white light spilled across the table. Lena did not flinch, but her shoulders tightened at the sudden brightness. Ethan saw it clearly now. Not fear of the dark. Fear of being exposed. "You can take the bathroom," he said, softer this time. "Towels are under the sink. Door sticks, so you have to lift a little when you close it." "You are remarkably calm," she said. "About what?" "About finding a stranger in your field during a storm, discovering that she is not human, and losing power in the same hour." Ethan considered that, then gave a tired half-smile. "You have clearly never owned irrigation equipment." To his surprise, that almost drew a laugh from her. It did not quite make it all the way out, but it warmed the room more than the stove had. She rose slowly from the chair, taking the dry clothes with a care that suggested she was unused to accepting anything she had not earned. At the bathroom door she paused, one hand resting lightly on the frame. "Ethan," she said, testing his name as if it were something fragile and unfamiliar. He looked up. "Yes." Her eyes held his for a beat too long, silver and guarded and carrying a fatigue that ran deeper than the storm outside. "If anyone comes to the house tonight," she said, "do not tell them I am here." The lantern hummed softly between them. Rain struck the roof in a hard new burst. Ethan set the towel down very carefully. "That," he said, "sounds like the kind of sentence that should have come a lot earlier." The bathroom door stayed half open for a moment after she slipped inside, as if even the house itself was not sure whether to trust her with privacy. Then it clicked shut, and Ethan was left alone with the lantern glow, the stove heat, and the weight of a warning he had not asked for. "Do not tell them I am here. Not if anyone comes." "When?" He stood in the kitchen listening to the storm and the muted sounds from down the hall. Water running. A cabinet opening. Silence again. He had lived alone long enough to know when a house felt different. Tonight it felt like it was holding its breath. Ethan moved on instinct more than thought. He checked the back door lock, then the front, then the side window by the mudroom that never sealed right in bad weather. He turned the weather radio volume lower and set the old 12-gauge from the hall closet on top of the refrigerator, not because he expected trouble, but because out here preparation was not paranoia. It was just what kept small problems from becoming permanent ones. When he passed the kitchen table again, he noticed what Lena had left behind. Her torn garment lay folded with too much care to be accidental, and on the edge of the chair sat something no storm traveler should have been carrying. A clasp, no bigger than his thumb. Silver-white metal, thin as a leaf, worked into. A pattern so intricate it made earth-made jewelry look clumsy. It was not flashy. It was precise. Beautiful in a way that suggested ceremony instead of decoration. Ethan did not touch it. He only looked for a second, then turned away and set a fresh towel on the counter. When Lena came back down the hallway a few minutes later, the kitchen seemed to draw itself upright around her. His flannel shirt hung loose at the shoulders and the sleeves were rolled twice at the wrists, but somehow she still wore it with the same impossible composure, like the clothes had adjusted to her rather than the other way around. Her silver hair was damp but combed back with careful fingers, revealing the clean line of her face and the faint shimmer under her skin when the lantern light struck at the right angle. Ethan noticed she had buttoned the collar all the way up. "Those fit about as badly as expected," he said. "They are serviceable," she replied, which was the sort of answer a person gave when trying not to admit they were comfortable. He poured the last of the coffee into her mug and pushed a plate of toast across the table. She looked at it, then at him. "You do not know who I am." "No," Ethan said. "But I know what being cold and hungry looks like." She sat slowly, like the chair might still be beneath her dignity, and took one small bite. Then another. She was trying very hard not to seem grateful, and for reasons Ethan could not have explained, that made him trust her more, not less. People who had spent their lives owing things to the wrong kind of power did not accept kindness easily. He took the chair across from her and folded his hands on the table. "I am not handing you over to anybody in the middle of the night," he said. "But if trouble is headed this way, I would appreciate a little honesty before it hits my front porch." Lena kept her eyes on the toast. The stove ticked softly as the metal expanded with heat. Rain moved over the roof in long steady sheets. "Honesty," she said at last, almost to herself, like the word belonged to another language. Then she lifted her gaze to his, and whatever answer she had nearly given disappeared. Behind the same polished restraint as before. "I can only offer this," she said quietly. "You have already done more for me than you should have. If that becomes costly, it will not be because I wished it." Ethan leaned back in his chair and studied her in the lantern light, this stranger with a false name, careful hands, and the bearing of someone who had once been surrounded by people and still learned how to be alone. "That is not much of an answer," he said. "It is the only one I have tonight." He let the silence sit between them for a while, not comfortable exactly, but no longer sharp. Finally he stood and reached for the lantern. "You can take my room," he said. Her expression changed at once. "No, it has got a real bed and a door that locks." "And where will you sleep?" "Couch." "That is unnecessary." Ethan gave her a tired look. "You fell out of the sky into a thunderstorm, Lena. Let me be a decent host without filing a complaint about it." This time the almost smile came back, faint and brief as a match struck in the dark. He saw it, and so did she, because it vanished immediately. But the room felt warmer after it. "One night," she said again. "At first light, I leave." Ethan picked up the lantern and headed for the hallway. "We will see what the weather says about that." Behind him, the storm kept scraping at the house, and somewhere far beyond the fields, too far off to be thunder and too steady to be machinery, something hummed across the dark like it was searching. The humming came back just before dawn. Ethan surfaced from shallow sleep on the couch with the feeling that something in the house had changed its rhythm. The stove had burned down to a low red bed of coals. Rain still moved over the roof, softer now, but the storm had not fully spent itself. Beyond the curtained windows, the world was a dim blue-gray wash of mud, fence posts, and standing water. And under all of it, so faint he almost thought he imagined it, there was that same distant vibration he had heard before. Steady. Searching. He sat up, rubbed a hand over his face, and listened. The sound faded into the morning wind. "Great," he thought. Either the county grid was dying in sections again, or the universe had decided his week was not interesting enough. He rose quietly and crossed the hallway. His bedroom door was still shut. No movement inside. For a strange moment, relief loosened something in his chest. She had not slipped out before dawn. She had not taken the truck. She had not vanished like a fever dream and left him to explain the silver clasp on the kitchen chair to himself for the next 10 years. The power kicked back on with a sudden hum, and the refrigerator started up hard enough to make him flinch. A second later, the coffee maker blinked 12 o'clock in accusation. Ethan muttered a tired greeting to modern life and headed for the kitchen. He had just scooped grounds into the filter when he heard the bedroom door open behind him. He turned. Lena stood at the end of the hall in his flannel shirt and gray sweatpants, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, one hand lightly resting on the frame as if she still was not convinced the house was real. The morning light made her look different. Not softer, exactly. Clearer. The strain in her face had eased during the night, but it had not disappeared. If anything, rest only made the discipline in her more obvious. "You are still here," Ethan said. "So are you," she replied. He jerked his chin toward the windows. "Road is half water. East Field is a pond. If you are planning a dramatic exit, you picked the wrong sunrise." She stepped closer to the table and looked out at the yard. The storm had flattened the grass in silver-green streaks, and the windmill on the ridge turned with a slow complaining groan. "How long until the road's clear?" she asked. "If the drainage ditch holds, maybe by afternoon. If it does not, tomorrow." Her jaw tightened almost invisibly. Ethan pretended not to notice. He poured her a cup before she could refuse and set it near the chair. This time she drank without argument. Small progress. "There is one problem," he said. "The pump relay in the lower field probably got fried last night. If I do not reset it before the runoff hits the south rows, I am going to lose half the soybeans." She looked at him over the rim of the mug. "You say that as though I am meant to do something about it." Ethan shrugged into his work jacket. "No. I say it because that is what my morning looks like." He reached for his boots and the old waterproof cap hanging by the door. "You can stay inside and continue judging my furniture if you want. There is bread, eggs, and enough canned soup to survive a siege. But I have work." He stepped onto the porch and got hit with the cold smell of soaked earth, diesel, and wet metal. The world outside looked scrubbed raw. Water streamed off the barn roof in thin silver ropes. The lower pasture had turned into a shallow reflecting pool, and somewhere beyond the tool shed, one of the goats complained with professional bitterness. Ethan had taken 3 steps into the yard when the screen door opened behind him. He turned to find Lena standing there, one hand on the frame, the hem of his borrowed pants rolled awkwardly above bare ankles. The wind lifted strands of silver hair across her face. "If I remain here until the road's clear," she said, each word sounding like it had been negotiated with her pride, "I would prefer not to do so uselessly." Ethan looked at her, then at the flooded yard, then back again. "You ever reset an irrigation relay?" "No, feed goats." "No, clear storm debris from drainage grates." She lifted her chin. "How difficult can rural engineering be?" Ethan felt the smile before he meant to. "That," he said, heading down the porch steps into the mud, "is the kind of sentence that usually costs me at least 4 hours." A beat later, he heard the screen door slam and her footsteps follow. By the time they reached the lower field, Lena had learned 3 things about rural engineering. First, mud did not care how dignified a person was. Second, goats had no respect for hierarchy. And third, Ethan Carter treated every broken part on his land the way some people treated living things, with patience, irritation, and a stubborn kind of loyalty that looked a lot like affection if you watched long enough. He waded shin-deep through runoff toward the relay box with a tool bag over one shoulder and handed her a long-handled rake without ceremony. "Grade is there," he said, pointing toward a drainage channel choked with storm. Debris. Leaves, branches, whatever washed down from the ridge. Clear it out so the ditch can pull water before the south rows drown. Lena looked at the rake, then at the ditch, then at Ethan. You are assigning me manual labor. I am assigning you the easy job. She made a quiet sound that could have meant disbelief, but she stepped into the mud anyway. 10 minutes later, the hem of the borrowed sweatpants was soaked, her hair had come loose in the wind, and she was using the rake with the focused irritation of someone determined not to lose an argument with a drainage system. Ethan, crouched beside the relay housing with a screwdriver between his teeth, looked over once and had to glance away before she caught the smile. You are enjoying this, she called over the wind. I am enjoying the fact that you have not quit. I do not quit. That explains the way you lost a fight with a storm and came back arguing. Her head turned sharply at that, but before she could answer, the low hum from the road reached them both. This time it was not distant. It was close. Mechanical. Deliberate. Ethan straightened slowly and looked toward the house. A black transport crawler had pulled up near the front gate, too sleek for county utility crews, too quiet for farm traffic. Water hissed under its tires. A second vehicle coasted in behind it. No official markings. No colony seal. Just dark glass and polished metal beaded with rain. Lena went very still. The change in her was immediate and complete. The irritation vanished. The uncertainty vanished. Even her breathing seemed to lock into place. Inside, she said quietly. Ethan did not move. Friends of yours? No, the word landed flat and cold. Then why do I feel like you knew they were coming? Her gaze snapped to his, silver eyes sharpened by something older than fear. Because people do not search in storms unless what they are looking for matters. Ethan took one slow breath. The crawler doors opened. 3 figures stepped out in dark weather cloaks, moving with the neat efficiency of people used to arriving where they were not welcome. No drawn weapons. No shouting. Just purpose. Which, Ethan thought, was somehow worse. Barn, he said. Lena did not argue. He led her through the side path between the fuel tank and the grain shed, boots splashing through pooled rainwater, until they reached the equipment barn behind the house. Inside, the air smelled like hay dust, machine oil, and wet cedar. Ethan pulled open the narrow storage space behind stacked feed bins. Get in. She looked at the cramped space, then at him. This is absurd. So is being found in my field after falling out of the sky, but we are adapting. He lowered his voice as the sound of footsteps carried faintly from the front yard. Stay quiet until I come back. For one brief second she did not look like a stranger wearing his clothes in his barn. She looked tired. Not physically. Deeply. Like there were worlds behind those eyes and none of them had been safe for a long time. Ethan, she said, and this time his name sounded less like a test and more like a warning. You do not understand what this may cost. He eased the storage door nearly shut, leaving only a narrow slit of gray daylight between the boards. Lady, he said, heading back toward the house through the smell of rain and diesel, out here, every season costs something. The walk back to the house felt longer than it had 10 minutes earlier. Rain tapped off the brim of Ethan's cap and slid cold down the back of his neck as he crossed the yard, boots sinking into mud that had already forgotten the shape of his tread. The transport crawlers stood at the front gate like patient dark animals, polished and silent except for the low electric hum under their chassis. Up close, they were even less local than he had guessed. No dust, no farm grit, no county decals, no freight tags. Their surfaces were seamless, expensive, and built by people who had never once had to repair anything with baling wire and stubbornness. The 3 strangers waited by the porch instead of coming to meet him. That told Ethan something too. People with real authority usually came closer. People who were unsure of the ground stayed where their vehicles could see them. The tallest of the three wore a charcoal weather cloak cut too clean to be practical. Rain beaded on the fabric and rolled off without soaking in. Beneath the hood, the face was almost human at first glance, until Ethan noticed the pale metallic sheen at the temples and the eyes, a cool gold that never quite blinked on time. "This is private agricultural property," Ethan said as he reached the steps. "County road ends a quarter-mile back." The figure inclined his head with the kind of courtesy that felt measured rather than sincere. "Mr. Ethan Carter." "Not a question. We apologize for the intrusion. We are conducting a recovery operation." "That sounds expensive." "It is important." Ethan set one boot on the bottom porch step and looked at the others. One remained near the crawler door. The third was scanning the property with a compact device held low at the hip, trying not to make it obvious. The device emitted a faint blue pulse every few seconds. "Recovery of what?" Ethan asked. "Someone," the tall one said. "A traveler who may have passed through this sector during the storm." Ethan let a beat pass, just enough to seem annoyed rather than alarmed. "You planning to narrow that down for the rural population?" The gold-eyed stranger studied him as if weighing whether simplicity was an insult or a tactic. "A woman," he said at last. "Not dangerous. Injured. In need of return." Ethan almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, but because it was neat. Too neat. He thought of Lena in the barn, standing still in borrowed clothes with mud on the hems and that warning in her voice. "Do not tell them I am here." "Storm threw half my fencing into the ditch and drowned the east rows," Ethan said. "I have been outside since dawn. I have not seen anybody except my goats, and they are all disappointments." One of the strangers glanced toward the barn. Ethan saw it happen and moved his weight just slightly, enough to block the line without seeming to. The scanner pulsed blue again, then faded. The tall one stepped closer to the porch, not threatening, just deliberate. "May we confirm that ourselves?" he asked. Ethan looked past him at the crawler, at the rain running in narrow silver lines off the hood, at the reflection of his own porch light in dark glass. Then he looked back. No, the answer sat in the wet air between them. The stranger's expression did not change, but something in the posture of the others tightened. Ethan went on before they could. "You do not have county authority. You do not have colony paperwork. And you showed up on a storm morning in vehicles worth more than my entire south field asking polite questions with scanner gear hidden at your side. So no, you do not get to walk into my house because you used a calm voice." For the first time, something like real interest flickered behind the gold eyes. "You are protecting someone you have not met before today." Ethan kept his face flat. "I am protecting my property." "From us?" Ethan gave a small shrug. "You tell me." Rain hissed off the porch roof. Somewhere behind the house, a wind chime struck once and spun. The tall stranger went still for so long that Ethan could hear the relay box down by the field clicking through its reset cycle. Then the figure reached slowly into the inner fold of the weather cloak and withdrew a thin silver object no larger than a credit chip. It glowed faintly even in the daylight. "If she is here," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the rehearsed civility, "you do not understand who you are hiding." Ethan looked at the silver token, then lifted his eyes to the stranger's face. "Funny," he said. "I was just starting to think the same thing about you." The strangers did not push past him. That was the part Ethan remembered later. Not the rain, not the silver token, not even the way the gold-eyed man seemed to weigh every inch of the porch like a chessboard. It was the restraint that stayed with him. People who could not force a door usually talked louder. These three did neither. The tall one closed his hand around the silver token and slipped it back inside the weather cloak. "Then perhaps," he said, "you should ask her why she would rather hide in a flooded farmhouse than be found by her own people." Ethan leaned one shoulder against the porch post and let the silence work for him. "Maybe I would," he said. "If I had somebody to ask." For the first time, one of the others looked openly irritated. The scanner at his side gave one last faint blue pulse, then dimmed. The gold-eyed stranger turned his gaze toward the road, toward the storm-bent fields, toward the roofline of a house that had survived too many seasons to care about polished vehicles and careful threats. When he looked back at Ethan, the courtesy had returned, thinner than before. "If she is still here when night falls," he said, "the next visitors may not request permission." Then he stepped back from the porch. No hurry. No wasted motion. Just that same unnerving certainty. The others followed him to the crawlers, rain sliding off their cloaks in silver threads. A moment later the vehicles turned soundlessly through the mud and rolled back toward the county road, black shapes dissolving into the wet gray morning. Ethan stayed on the porch until they were gone from sight. Only then did he let out the breath he had been holding. The yard looked ordinary again. Mud, puddles, bent grass, the half-flooded ditch along the gate. But the ordinary feeling of it had gone. He crossed the porch, stepped down into the rain, and headed for the barn. Inside, the dimness smelled of hay, wet cedar, and machine oil. Water dripped steadily from the eaves. For a second he saw nothing. Then the narrow storage door opened by an inch, and Lena stepped out of the shadows. She had not moved far from where he left her. His flannel shirt was still buttoned to the throat. Her hands were empty. Her face, however, had changed. Not frightened. Finished with pretending. "They showed you something," she said. Ethan nodded once. "A token. Said I did not understand who I was hiding." He watched her carefully. "Want to tell me if that was the first honest sentence I have heard all morning?" The barn went quiet except for the rain tapping on the tin roof. Lena looked past him through the open side door where the fields lay flat and silver beneath the storm light. When she spoke, her voice had lost the edges of the false name. It sounded older somehow. Heavier. "My name is not Lena Vale," she said. "I assumed that part." "No," she said softly. "You assumed I was running from something small enough to fit inside a lie." She turned back to him, and there was no hesitation now, no searching for a cover story. "My name is Lasara Vane." The name meant nothing to Ethan for half a second. Then memory clicked into place like metal teeth catching. News channels on the radio. Trade debates from the Colony Network. Political analysts. Talking in that dry distant way people did when it was somebody else's empire. House Vane. The Thellery Crown. The missing sovereign after the collapse of the palace security grid 3 days ago. Ethan stared at her across the dim barn and felt the whole scale of his world tilt without moving. "You are telling me," he said slowly, "that I pulled a queen out of my soybean field." Lasara held his gaze. "I am telling you that the people at your gate do not serve me." Rain whispered through the cracked siding. Somewhere in the loft, a chain clinked softly in the breeze. Ethan ran a hand over the back of his neck and let out one disbelieving breath. "That would have been useful information yesterday." "Yesterday," she said, "I did not know whether you were kind, foolish, or bought. And now?" Something fragile crossed her face then, dawn almost before he could name it. Not softness. Not quite trust. More like the first crack in ice after a long winter. "Now," Lasara said, "I know you opened your door before you knew my value. Where I come from, that is rarer than loyalty." The word settled between them with the weight of weather. Ethan leaned against the workbench and looked at her again, really looked this time, not as a stranger in borrowed clothes or a problem dropped into his field by a storm, but as someone whose name could move ships and armies and men in polished vehicles who asked permission only when it amused them. Queen Lasara Vane. The title did not fit in the barn. It did not fit beside feed bins and rusted brackets and a tractor that still needed a new fuel regulator. And yet she stood there with rain light on her silver hair and mud drying on the cuffs of his sweatpants, and somehow the impossible thing about her was not the crown. It was that she looked tired enough to set it down. Why here? Ethan asked at last. Of all places. Lysara's gaze drifted toward the open side door, toward the storm-washed fields and the low house beyond them. Because no one looking for a sovereign thinks to search where work is louder than status, she said. And because the route I took was damaged in the storm. She hesitated, then added, also because I was losing altitude. Ethan let out a short breath that might have been a laugh in a better hour. Good to know royalty crashes same as the rest of us. A faint flicker crossed her expression, brief and almost grateful. Then the air changed. Not inside the barn. Outside. Ethan felt it the way farmers felt hail before it hit, a pressure shift, a subtle wrongness humming through the wet morning. He turned toward the yard. The rain had thinned to a cold mist, and through it he saw motion above the house. 3 dark shapes rising over the tree line on silent rotors, too angular to be county survey drones, too low to be passing traffic. One hovered over the driveway. Another drifted toward the lower field. The third held position above the roof, steady as a held breath. Those yours? Ethan asked. No, Lysara said, and for the first time since he met her, he heard something unguarded in her voice. Not panic. Urgency. Ethan, they are escalating. As if in answer, the first drone emitted a pale scanning beam that swept across the yard, over the porch, across the barn siding. The old weather vane on the roof shivered. The floodlight by the gate sparked once and went dark. A second later, something popped near the lower field relay, followed by the flat mechanical cough of a system failing under strain. Ethan swore and stepped toward the door. That is my south pump station. Leave it, Lysara said. They want movement. They want us exposed. Another pulse swept the property. The house lights flashed inside the kitchen window, then cut out again. From beyond the ridge came a distant electronic whine as the perimeter shutters on the equipment shed tried to cycle and stalled halfway. Ethan felt the whole place around him, every repair he had made by hand, every bolt tightened in bad weather, every acre that paid his mortgage one stubborn season at a time. They are frying my grid, he said. Yes. And if the pump stays down, the runoff is going to wipe out the south rows by noon. Lysara stepped closer, her voice lower now, stripped clean of rank. If they confirm I am here, they will not stop at your irrigation system. Ethan looked at her, at the truth in her face, then back at the yard where one of the drones pivoted slowly toward the grain shed. The choice arrived all at once, not dramatic, not noble, just hard and plain as wet earth. Run, hide, or stand in the middle of your own life and refuse to be pushed out of it. He grabbed the relay bag from the bench and headed for the barn door. What are you doing? Lysara asked. Ethan did not slow. Saving the field. Ethan. His name stopped him only long enough to turn. She was standing exactly where the lantern light had caught her the night before, but there was nothing hidden in her now. Not the queen. Not the woman. Just the distance between them and whatever came next. If you go out there, she said, you are choosing this. Rain misted through the doorway and silvered the air between them. Ethan set his jaw and looked past the hovering drones to the farmhouse, the flooded ditch, the bent rows fighting to stay upright under a sky that had not finished testing them. No, he said quietly. I am choosing what is mine. The mud tried to keep his boots with every step. Ethan pushed through it anyway, relay bag banging against his leg, rain mist cooling the back of his neck as the drone above the yard turned in a slow deliberate circle. The south pump station sat beyond the drainage trench at the edge of the lower field, half shrouded in silver spray where runoff spilled over the bank. Another pale scan passed across the property, and the relay mast beside the pump gave off a shower of harmless but expensive sparks. Ethan felt the loss of each one like a pulled tooth. The manual bypass is in the lower housing, he called over his shoulder without looking back. If I can get the intake running and open the ditch gates, the field might survive. He expected no answer. Then he heard her footsteps in the mud behind him, lighter than his but no less determined. "You are impossible," Lasara said. Ethan glanced back just long enough to see her catch up, silver hair blown loose again, borrowed clothes darkened by rain, her face set with the same calm he had first mistaken for arrogance. "You can wait in the barn," he said. "Apparently I cannot," she replied. Another drone swept low over the soybean rows, its scanning beam cutting a pale line across the waterlogged plants. Ethan crouched by the relay box, popped the warped panel with the heel of his hand, and winced when he saw the inside. The surge had blackened two couplers and fused the sensor node into a glossy lump. "That is bad, right?" Lasara asked. "That is a technical term, yes." He dug through the tool bag, found a pair of insulated pliers, and started pulling scorched wiring free while rain dripped from the bill of his cap onto the open housing. The pump station gave a weak mechanical shudder and fell silent again. Water kept pouring down the trench toward the south rows. 10 more minutes of this and the roots would drown. "Hold that," he said, passing her the flashlight without checking whether queens were accustomed to holding flashlights in flooded fields. The beam stayed steady in her hand. Too steady. He noticed that. Most people shifted, fidgeted, let their attention wander when machinery came apart in weather. Lasara did not. She watched every movement like it mattered. "Your hands are shaking," she said quietly. "Cold." That was not a question. Ethan shot her a glance. "You always inspect people while they are elbows deep in damaged hardware. Only when they insist on pretending they are not afraid." Another scan swept over them. The light hit the metal housing and reflected blue against her face, and for one strange second she looked less like someone hiding on a farm and more like what she really was, not because of grandeur, but because of focus. Presence. The kind that made a person look finished even in chaos. Ethan forced the last ruined coupler free and reached for a spare. "Fear is useful," he said. "Panic is expensive. And stubbornness? That is free." To his surprise, she gave a low breath that might have been a laugh. Then the nearest drone dipped lower, and the beam sharpened into a narrow pulse aimed directly at the control mast. The old warning buzzer on the station shrieked once. Ethan swore and lunged for the manual crank assembly bolted to the side of the gate system. "They are going to overload the actuator," he said. "If the gate locks shut, the trench backs up and the whole lower section goes under. Tell me what to do." He looked at her. Rain ran down her face and darkened the collar of his shirt, but she did not blink. Not at the drones. Not at the field. Not at him. In that moment he stopped seeing a sovereign who had hidden in his house and started seeing something simpler and harder to ignore. Someone who had decided to stand where the damage was. "When I say now," he said, handing her the pry bar, "you put every ounce of that royal dignity into keeping this brace from slipping." Her chin lifted a fraction. "I have more than dignity, Ethan." "Good," he said, bracing both hands on the crank. "Because this farm runs on torque." He heaved down. The mechanism groaned, resisted, then moved by inches. Water surged against the gate with a sound like a long-held breath breaking loose. Lasara jammed the pry bar into place and held it there as the whole frame shuddered under pressure. Mud splashed up their legs. The drone circled above, restless and watching, but the gate opened another inch, then another, until the backed-up runoff tore through the channel and rushed away from the drowning rows. Ethan stayed bent over the crank, breathing hard, rain and sweat indistinguishable now. Beyond the trench, the soybeans lifted in the moving water instead of disappearing under it. Beside him, Lasara still held the brace with both hands, shoulders tight, jaw set, looking nothing like a queen in a palace and more like a woman who had just helped save 12 acres because a farmer would not abandon them. Ethan straightened slowly and looked at the field, then at her. "There," he said, breathless. "Now they know I am serious." Lasara followed his gaze to the circling drones and then back to the land fighting to remain itself under a bruised gray sky. No, she said softly. Now I do. The drones changed position all at once. Ethan saw it in the way their circling loosened, then tightened again, no longer curious, no longer testing. They had what they came for now. Not a face. Not a title. A pattern. A farmer who would not step aside and a woman who had finally stopped looking like cargo. One of the machines rose higher over the field while the other two angled toward the house, their pale scanlines crossing over the roof, the barn, the grain shed, mapping everything he had spent 10 years paying off one season at a time. Ethan wiped rain from his eyes with the back of his wrist and looked toward the porch. They are marking the property, he said. Lasara released the pry bar slowly, as if deciding not just what to do next, but who she was willing to be when she did it. The wind pulled silver strands of hair across her face. She did not brush them away. Yes, she said. Because hiding has ended. There was no drama in the words. That was what made them land so hard. Ethan expected fear, or regret, or at least the sharp edge of someone cornered. Instead her voice carried a calm that felt older than the storm, older than the farm, older than the polished machines circling overhead. She stepped away from the floodgate and reached beneath the collar of his flannel shirt. For a second Ethan thought she was retrieving the silver clasp he had seen on the kitchen chair. What she drew free was not jewelry at all, but a narrow pendant no larger than a finger joint, white metal wrapped around a dark blue crystal that seemed to hold its own weather inside. It pulsed once against her palm. The air around them answered. Ethan felt it ripple over his skin like the pressure before lightning. That, he said, breathing a little harder than he meant to, would have been useful information a few hours ago. A few hours ago, Lasara replied, her gaze fixed on the drones, I could not risk revealing it. Now they have already confirmed enough. She closed her hand around the pendant and lifted it chest high. The silver lines beneath her skin, the ones he had only glimpsed in fragments before, came alive in the rain-muted light. Not glowing exactly. Waking. Fine channels of pale blue shimmer traced from her throat to her wrists, elegant and exact, like a hidden circuit remembering its purpose. Ethan forgot the field for half a second. Forgot the mud. Forgot even the drones. It was not beauty that struck him, though there was that too. It was recognition. The sudden unmistakable sense that everything about her had been built to carry more than herself. One of the drones dipped lower. The pendant flashed. A clear tone cut through the rain, pure and bright and impossibly steady, as if someone had struck crystal somewhere above the clouds. The machines overhead froze mid-pattern. There. Scanlines flickered. Then every porch light on the property burst back to life at once, not warm yellow, but a clean white brilliance that turned the flooded field into mirrors. Ethan heard a different sound rolling in from the western horizon, deeper than engines, smoother than thunder. He looked up. 3 ships broke through the low cloud deck in silent formation, their hulls silver blue against the bruised sky, too large for local traffic and too disciplined for chance. They did not dive. They did not threaten. They simply arrived, and the entire morning seemed to rearrange itself around that fact. The drones hesitated, then peeled back from the house in a sharp retreat, their confidence gone all at once. Ethan let out a slow breath he did not realize he had been holding. Beside him, Lasara lowered her hand. The pendant dimmed, but her posture did not. She stood straighter now, not because of pride, but because there was finally no reason left to bend. Those are yours, Ethan said. They are loyal to the crown, she answered. That is not always the same thing. The lead ship settled above the flooded access road, stirring the mist without tearing at the fields. A narrow beam of pale light extended downward, not onto her, but onto the open ground between them, like an invitation that would not presume. Ethan looked at it, then at her borrowed clothes soaked through with rain and mud at the hem, then back at the ships that had crossed half a world for a signal no longer hidden. So this is the part where you leave, he said. Lasara turned to him, and for one quiet second the queen was gone again, replaced by the woman who had sat in his kitchen holding cheap coffee like it was the first honest thing she had touched in years. "No," she said softly. "This is the part where I stop running." The ships did not stay long enough to turn the farm into a spectacle. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. No lines of armored guards marching across his field. No grand announcements spilling from the sky. Just precision. Just purpose. The lead vessel held steady above the flooded access road while two smaller craft peeled away after the retreating drones, vanishing into the thinning cloud cover without sound. A minute later, a narrow shuttle descended from the belly of the larger ship and settled near the front gate with hardly more disturbance than a hard wind. 3 figures emerged, cloaked in slate-gray rain gear marked at the collar with the same silver-blue geometry Ethan had seen hidden beneath Lasara's skin. They approached on foot, stopped 10 yards away, and dropped to one knee in the mud. No one spoke at first. The rain had softened to a fine mist. Water moved through the open floodgate in a clear rushing line. Behind them, the soybean rows still stood, bent but unbroken. Ethan looked at the kneeling figures, then at Lasara beside him, and understood something he had not fully grasped before. It was not power that made people bow. It was certainty. Not fear of what she could do, but faith in what she carried. The tallest of the 3 lifted his head. He was older than the others, with silver threaded through dark hair at the temples and the kind of face that had practiced restraint for decades. "Your Majesty," he said, and even his quiet voice seemed to settle the air around it, "the Western Fleet is secure. The palace perimeter has been partially restored. The Council requests your return." Lasara did not answer immediately. She stood with mud on her borrowed cuffs and rain on her lashes, looking less like a symbol than a person deciding whether she could trust the world she had left. Then her eyes moved to Ethan. Not past him. To him. "My return," she said at last, "will not be to the same palace that failed to hold." The older man bowed his head lower. "Then it will become one worthy of holding again." Ethan let out a slow breath and glanced toward the house. The porch light still burned white from the ship's systems overriding his grid. The screen door hung slightly crooked from years of weather. One of the goats had somehow gotten loose and was already nosing at the wet feed sack by the shed as if empires had always been background noise to breakfast. It struck him then, with the strange calm that sometimes comes after disaster fails to arrive, that his life was still right there. The same ditch. The same porch. The same field that would need 3 days of repair and probably 2 new relay boards. The universe had not become less absurd. He had just met it face to face. Lasara turned fully toward him. "Ethan Carter," she said, and the men behind her lowered their heads again as if his name itself had entered some official record. "You sheltered me without title. You defended this place without promise of reward. Name what should be restored, and it will be." Ethan looked at her for a moment, rain ticking softly on the metal relay housing behind them. He thought of the ruined couplers, the washed-out South Trench, the county rates on water access, the farms farther east that never got relief because nobody important drove that road. He could have asked for money. More land. A government contract. Enough comfort to never fear a drought year again. Instead he hooked his thumbs through his belt, stared past the kneeling delegation to the drowning county road, and said, "Fix the irrigation grid for every farm on this line, not just mine. Waive the water surcharges for the season. And if anybody from your court comes back onto my property, they knock first." One of the younger attendants looked up in surprise. The older one did not. He only inclined his head as if the request made a kind of sense that power too often forgot. Lasara's mouth curved, small and real and warmer than the first almost smile he had seen in his kitchen. "Done," she said. The word carried no performance. It was simply true. The attendants rose. Orders were spoken softly into wrist comms. Lights moved inside the shuttle. Somewhere above the clouds, vast engines adjusted their patient hold on the sky. Ethan expected that to be the moment she stepped away from him for good. Instead Lasara remained where she was, close enough that he could see the rain gathering on the edge of her lashes, the silver channels beneath her skin dim now but not hidden, the exhaustion that had not vanished even with rescue at her back. "I will have clothes returned," she said, glancing down at his mud-streaked flannel. "I make no promises about the sweatpants." Ethan huffed a quiet laugh. "Keep them. They have seen history now." That earned him a sound from her that was almost a laugh too, brief and low and startlingly human in the wet gray light. Then the moment thinned, not because it broke, but because dawn finally began to push through the storm. The cloud cover opened by slow degrees over the eastern ridge, and pale gold spilled across the fields, turning standing water into sheets of fire. The soybeans shimmered. The barn roof gleamed. The whole farm looked newly made and badly damaged at the same time, which Ethan suspected was true of more than farms. Lasara followed his gaze to the horizon. "Where I come from," she said softly, "they believe a throne teaches distance." Ethan squinted into the sunrise. "That sounds lonely." "It is." He nodded once. "Then maybe do not let it teach you that." Silence settled after that, easy and full. Not awkward. Not unfinished. Just honest. Behind them, the shuttle waited. Ahead of them, the fields steamed under first light. And when Lasara finally turned toward the path that would take her back to ships and councils and a crown she no longer looked willing to wear the old way, she paused only once. "If I return," she said, without looking back yet, "it will not be as a stranger." Ethan watched the sun catch along the wet fence line, bright enough to hurt, and answered in the same plain voice he used for weather and broken equipment and truths too simple to decorate. "Then come back before planting season," he said. "I can always use another hand at the floodgate." This time she did laugh, quiet as rain leaving a roof. Then she walked toward the waiting shuttle while morning opened over the farm in widening bands of gold, and Ethan stood ankle-deep in mud beside a saved field and watched a queen go home